Every Sunday for 6 years, my mother-in-law took one small bite of whatever I'd cooked, set her fork down with a little click, and told the whole family it was peasant food. And every Sunday, my husband Paul looked down at his plate and said nothing. I remember the smell of her lemon polish, the good kind she only used for company. I remember the sound of her rings clicking when she reached for the rolls. And I remember sitting at the far end of that table, 32, 33, 34 years old, a professional chef being told by a woman who'd never once eaten in my restaurant that I couldn't cook. Here's the thing you need to know before we start. Being insulted at that table wasn't the worst part. It wasn't even close. The worst part was the man beside me who studied his fork. What none of them knew, what I didn't fully understand myself yet, was that 300 quiet Tuesdays at a 40-seat restaurant were building toward one Thursday morning when 2 million people would read a stranger's verdict on that exact dish. And the word that stranger would use, the word that would go national and change my whole life, was the same word she used every Sunday: peasant food. He'd just mean it as the highest praise a cook can be given. Welcome back to Quiet Defender Stories, where women who got counted out sit you down and tell you what happened next. I'm glad you're here. If a Sunday table like that one has ever gone quiet on you, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And be sure to subscribe, because you're going to want to hear how a plate of my grandmother's gravy ended 6 years of silence in one afternoon. Let me back up, because you need to know who was sitting at that table, and you need to know who I was before a man with a notebook walked into my restaurant and never told me his name. My mother-in-law is Judith Russo, and Judith runs a family the way some women run a kingdom, from the head of a dinner table with a serving spoon for a scepter. She raised 3 sons in that house and fed them from that kitchen, and she has spent her whole life being told she is the best cook anyone knows, and she believes it the way some people believe in weather. It was never vanity to her. I understand that now. It was the whole of who she was allowed to be. And the day her middle son Paul brought home a wife who cooked for a living, Judith looked at me the way a reigning queen looks at a rival she intends to crush before anyone can crown her. I'm a chef. I know that's the twist you can already see coming, so let me hand you the part you can't. I never hid it. That was never the game. The family knew I had a restaurant. They simply decided, all of them together, that it didn't count. To Judith, restaurant food was fussy and cold and pretend, a thing you paid strangers for because you were too selfish to feed your own people with your own 2 hands. Anybody can hide behind a staff and a fancy stove, dear, she'd say, warm as pie. Real cooking is what a woman does on a Sunday for the people who love her. And so the thing I'd trained for and bled for got filed, quietly and completely, as a hobby I did instead of learning to actually cook. And the proof, in Judith's court, was that every Sunday I brought a dish to her table, and every Sunday she found it wanting, because she'd decided how the review would read before she ever lifted the lid. Remember that. The verdict came before the food. It always did. Hold on to it, because it's the whole hinge of this story. Now I have to tell you about the sauce, because the sauce is the beating heart of all of it. My grandmother was Lucia Marino, my nonna, and she raised me more than my own parents did, in a narrow kitchen that always smelled of garlic blooming in oil, and tomatoes going soft and slow on the back burner. She came to this country with almost nothing and a head full of recipes she'd never written down. And she taught me to cook the way you teach a language, by making a child do it 1,000 times until it lives in her hands. The ragu was hers, her Sunday gravy, short rib and pork and San Marzano tomatoes, and a whisper of cinnamon she swore you should never taste but should always miss if it was gone. 6 hours. It could not be rushed. And Nonna, stirring it with a wooden spoon worn thin on one side from 50 years of her hand, used to call it peasant food, and she said it like a medal, because peasant food, she told me, is the food you make with love when you don't have money, which makes it the only food that was ever really about love at all. When Nonna died, I was 24 and in culinary school, and she left me almost nothing, because she had almost nothing, except one thing, a dented tin recipe box, the kind that once held Christmas cookies, packed with index cards in her cramped hand, splattered and soft at the corners from decades of being pulled out and put back. On the top card, the ragu, and beneath the recipe, a line she wrote to me that I did not understand for 11 more years. Elena, she wrote, in her careful broken English, you will never make a dish good enough for a person who has decided not to like it. So cook for the ones who are hungry, not for the ones who are never satisfied. I kept that box on a shelf in my restaurant kitchen, where I could see it every day. I did not know, at 24, that my grandmother had reached forward through time and described my mother-in-law before I'd ever met her. Remember the tin box. Remember the cinnamon you're supposed to miss. They come back. Here is how the Sundays actually went, and I need you to feel the weight of 6 years of them stacked one on top of another. Paul and I would drive to Judith's on Sunday afternoon, and I would bring a dish, because everyone brought something and Judith presided over all of it. And every week I made something real, something good, often something straight out of Nana's box, because those were the recipes that meant the most, and because I was, God help me, still trying to win a game I didn't yet understand was rigged. And every week the same thing happened. Judith would wait until everyone was seated, until the table was quiet and the audience was ready, and then she would take one small, theatrical bite, set her fork down with that click, and deliver her verdict to the whole family with a smile so warm you could almost miss the blade folded inside it. Bless your heart, dear. It's a little heavy, a little rustic. It's peasant food, but you tried. And the family would murmur and pass the rolls, and my face would go hot, and I would look at my husband, and my husband would be looking at his plate. That was the part that actually broke something in me, over 6 years, one Sunday at a time. Not Judith. Judith I understood, the way you understand a dog, guarding a bone it was starved into needing. It was Paul. Paul, who had fallen in love with me partly over a bowl of that exact gravy, who knew precisely what I was, who had a restaurant full of good reviews he could have pointed to, and who chose, every single Sunday, to study his fork while his mother called his wife's cooking peasant food in front of everyone. And then, every single Sunday, out by the car in the dark, the same 7 words, said like a little prayer meant to fix it. That's just how Mom is. Let it go. He said it like wisdom. He said it like he was the reasonable one, the peacemaker keeping everyone comfortable. And what I heard, more clearly every year, was a man who'd decided his mother's comfort was worth more than his wife's dignity, and had found a phrase that let him do nothing and feel noble about it. That's just how Mom is. Let it go. 6 years, 500 times, near enough. I want you to carry that sentence with you, because the day it finally stops is the day this whole story turns. If you've ever swallowed an insult from someone you love just to keep a Sunday from breaking, drop a comment, because you already know the exact taste of it, that copper taste of a thing you're not allowed to spit out. Stay with me, and subscribe now, because there's a Tuesday coming, an ordinary October Tuesday, and a stranger walks into my restaurant on it, and I don't recognize him, and 11 days later he detonates my entire life. You'll want to be here when he does. Let me tell you about the restaurant, because that was the one room Judith never set foot in, and the reason none of them ever saw what was coming. I named it Lucia, after my grandmother. I built it slowly, over years, the way Nona built her sauce. No shortcuts, nothing rushed. 40 seats on a quiet street in the city. I served the food I actually believed in, the food that lived in her tin box, lifted where it needed lifting, and left alone where it was already perfect. And I want to walk you through those years the way I lived them, because the whole trick of my life in that stretch was that I lived 2 of them at once. Year 1 of Lucia, I worked the line myself 6 nights a week and cried in the walk-in twice. I learned my regulars by name, and I learned what their grandmothers used to cook, and I fed them like they were mine. And on the 7th day, Sunday, I drove out to Harmon and let Judith call my food garbage in front of her table, and drove home, and got up Monday and did it all again. 2 lives. The one where I was somebody, in my whites, on my own floor, and the one where I was a girl who made peasant food and tried. Same woman. My husband, I came to understand, preferred the second one, because she was easier to sit beside while his mother talked. Year 2, Lucia started to fill on weeknights, which is the quiet miracle every restaurant prays for. Word of mouth. People leaving saying it tasted like home. And meanwhile, through Paul's sister-in-law Gina, who was kind and talked too much, which are often the same gift, the news from the family flowed the other direction. Judith had won the church cook-off again. Judith had catered the deacon's retirement, and everyone said no one feeds a room like Carol Russo's Judith. Judith had started saying, at those bigger gatherings, with a sorrowful little shake of the head, that it was such a shame Elena had gotten so wrapped up in her little restaurant that she'd forgotten how a family eats. That was the dual life. In one town, Judith was collecting trophies for feeding 40 church ladies. In another city, I was quietly building something a stranger would one day drive across a state to eat. Neither of us knew about the other's scoreboard. Only one of those scoreboards was about to go national. Year 3. I nearly walked away from the Sundays entirely, and I want to be honest that the only reason I didn't was Paul, and the fact that I still, at 33, believed if I just cooked well enough for long enough, Judith would one day taste it and mean it. That's the sickness Nana's card was trying to cure me of, and I couldn't read it yet, so I kept bringing the gravy, and Judith kept calling it peasant food, and Paul kept looking at his fork, and Lucia kept getting better, because the only place my cooking was ever judged honestly was the room full of strangers who had no reason to lie. Remember that difference. That's the engine of everything. Judith judged me in a room she controlled, where she was the critic and the jury and the audience all at once. Strangers judged me in a room where the only thing on the plate was the food. She dealt in the verdict at her own table. I dealt in what people actually tasted, and it never once occurred to her that there was a bigger room than her dining room, one where none of her power meant a thing. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday night in October of year 4, a man came in alone and ordered the ragu. I didn't know who he was. That's the whole point of how it works. The good ones come in quiet, alone, or in twos, and they never announce themselves, because the second a kitchen knows a critic is in the room, the food stops being honest. He was unremarkable, a middle-aged man with a notebook he kept under the table where he thought no one could see it, and even that didn't tip me, because plenty of people take notes on a good meal. He ordered a few things, and he ordered Nana's ragu, which lived on my menu under her word for it, gravy, because I refused to call it anything fancier than she had. And I cooked it the way I cooked it every night, 6 hours of patience, and a whisper of cinnamon you should only miss if it's gone. He ate quietly. He left a normal tip. He told the server the food was lovely, which everyone says, and he walked out into the October dark, and I never gave him another thought, because 40 happy strangers is just a good Tuesday, and I had a Wednesday to prep for. Remember the man with the notebook. In 11 days, he is going to be the most important stranger I've ever cooked for, and I'm going to be standing in my kitchen shaking. His name, I'd learn on the 11th day, was Julian Reeve, and he was the lead critic for one of the largest food publications in the country, the kind millions of people read on a Thursday morning with their coffee, the kind that can make or end a restaurant in a single paragraph. And on that October Tuesday, he had come to Lucia anonymously, and he had eaten my grandmother's peasant food, and he'd gone home and written about it. I found out the way you find out about an earthquake, which is that the ground was already moving before I understood what it was. It was a Thursday, and my phone started buzzing at 6 in the morning, and did not stop. Reservations, 200 by noon, for a restaurant with 40 seats, then 500. Messages from chefs I admired, from purveyors, from people I hadn't spoken to in years. My sous chef called before I'd had coffee and just said, "Elena, have you seen it? Sit down and read it right now." And I sat at my own kitchen table in the house I shared with Paul, and read the review that was already, by that hour, being read by more people than would ever sit at Judith Russo's table in 100 lifetimes. I won't pretend I remember every word, but I remember the shape of it, the way you remember the shape of the best thing anyone ever said about you. Julian Reeve wrote that, in an age of restaurants trying to dazzle you, he'd found one trying to feed you, and that the difference was the entire art. And then he wrote about the ragu. He wrote that he'd eaten a great deal of ambitious food that year, food stacked and foamed and tweezered, and that a plate of slow gravy at a 40-seat place named for someone's grandmother had quietly undone all of it. He called it the best single dish he'd eaten in a year. He wrote, and this is the line that went through me like a current, that some cooks feed your mouth, and a rare few feed the part of you that's been hungry since childhood, and that the chef at Lucia belonged to the second, smaller, more important kind. He named the dish exactly as I served it, under my grandmother's word, gravy, and he described it, in a national publication, for 2 million readers, as peasant food elevated to something close to holy. Peasant food. There it was, printed, in the biggest room in the world. The exact 2 words Judith had used to cut me 52 times a year for 6 years, except now they were the highest praise a national critic knew how to give. I sat in my kitchen and I cried, And I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't the reservations and it wasn't the fame. It was that a stranger with no reason to be kind, no family politics, no stake in building me up or tearing me down, had tasted my nana's sauce and understood it exactly, had tasted the 6 hours, and the cinnamon you're supposed to miss, and the 50 years of a worn wooden spoon, and had called it what it was, which was love, made into food, by a woman who learned it from a woman who had nothing but love to cook with. He tasted everything Judith had spent 6 years pretending wasn't there. Paul came into the kitchen while I was still holding the phone, because his own phone had started going too, his brothers texting, the news moving through the family faster than any of Judith's Sunday verdicts ever had, and I watched my husband's face do something complicated, and I understood, in that moment, more than I'd understood in 6 years. He wasn't purely happy for me. Some of him was, but some of him was afraid, because the story his family told about me, the story he'd agreed to sit inside every Sunday, had just been contradicted in front of 2 million people, and my husband did not know how to live in a world where his wife was somebody his mother had to reckon with. He said, "That's amazing, Elle," in a voice working very hard. And then he said the thing that told me the 6 years had been exactly what I feared. He said, "You don't have to make it a thing at Sunday dinner, though. Let's not rub Mom's face in it. Let's not rub Mom's face in it." His wife had just been named the best cook in the region by a national critic, and my husband's first strategic instinct was to protect his mother's feelings from the truth. That was the moment something in me that had been folding for 6 years finally creased the other way and stayed there. If you've watched somebody you love spend your dignity to keep a room comfortable, put the words "let it go" in the comments, because you know that phrase better than your own name. And subscribe before you do, because there's a dinner coming, and my mother-in-law is about to build me the exact stage I need, without knowing she's doing it. You'll want to be in that room. Here is where my life stopped being a matter of keeping the peace, and started being a matter of the truth, and I need you to hold the difference, because it's everything. For 6 years, Judith had controlled the only room that counted, her dining room, where she was the judge and I was the defendant, and the verdict was fixed before dinner. She dealt in a performance she could always win, because she owned the stage. But the review had done a thing she could never undo. It had put the truth about my cooking into a room she didn't control, a room bigger than her whole world, and it had made that truth public, printed, permanent, impossible to reword. She could tell the family the gravy was peasant food. She could not tell 2 million readers of a national publication that they were wrong to love it. For the first time in 6 years, I had something Judith couldn't out-talk, and it wasn't my voice, and it wasn't an argument. It was the plain printed truth, sitting in the biggest room in the world, waiting on a table for anyone to read. I did not call Judith. I want to be clear, because the cheap version of this story is the one where I blast the link into the family group chat with a triumphant note and demand my apology. That's not what Nana taught me, and it's not what wins. Her card said cook for the hungry, not for the never satisfied, and I finally understood that forcing Judith to admit she was wrong was just cooking for the never satisfied all over again, in a different pot. So I did something quieter and far more patient. I let the next Sunday come, and I decided that when it did, I would bring no argument and no speech. I would bring the truth, printed, and I would set it on the table the way I'd set down the sauce for 6 years, and I would let it do the only thing the truth ever needs to do, which is sit there being true in front of everyone. And the timing did a thing for me I could never have planned. That coming Sunday wasn't an ordinary Sunday. It was Judith and her husband's 40th wedding anniversary, and Judith had planned a real event, extended family and a dozen guests, some of them the friends from her club she most wanted to impress, an afternoon built from the ground up to be Judith's finest hour as the matriarch, presiding over a table she'd cooked herself, receiving her due. She had, in other words, done the thing that always happens in these stories. She built me an audience. She gathered, into one room, the exact people who most needed to see the truth, on the one afternoon designed to showcase her power, and she had no idea the review going national had turned her showcase into my stage. I spent that week calm in a way that clearly unsettled Paul, because a woman who isn't fighting when you expect her to fight is a woman who's decided something. He kept circling, asking what I was going to do Sunday, telling me again not to make it a thing, and I told him I was going to come to his mother's anniversary and be gracious, which was true, and which was the most unsettling thing I could have said, because he could hear I meant it and couldn't figure out why. I printed the review. Not to wave, just one clean copy, folded once, tucked in my bag, the way you carry a thing you might need. I thought about whether that was too dramatic and decided it wasn't, because I was not going to say a single cruel word. I was only going to make sure the truth was in the room in a form Judith couldn't reword. Everything about it was real, printed by people with no stake in my family, able to stand in front of anyone. That was the whole difference between Judith and me. She dealt in how things sounded at her table. I dealt in what was actually true, and I'd let the truest thing speak for itself. Sunday came, and Judith's house was magnificent. I'll give her that, because she was magnificent at exactly this. Flowers everywhere, the good china, a table that went on forever, and Judith at the center of it in a beautiful dress, glowing, receiving her guests, presiding. She had cooked all day, and she wanted everyone to know it, and she moved through the room accepting compliments like a woman collecting a debt the world owed her. Her club friends were there, the ones she wanted to impress, and one of them, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Deborah, kept glancing at me with a small, puzzled expression I couldn't place. Remember Deborah. She's about to become the most important guest at that party, and Judith invited her herself. We sat. Judith presided over the meal she'd made, and it was good, honestly. A good home cook's very good food, and I said so, and I meant it, because I have never in my life needed to tear down another cook to stand up straight. And near the end, when the wine had loosened the table and Judith had her audience exactly where she wanted it, she did the thing she could not help doing, the thing that was as much a part of her as her own hands. She decided to perform her superiority one more time, in front of her best guests, at her own anniversary, and she chose me to do it too, the way she always had. She tapped her glass, warm and glowing, and told the table how lovely it was to have the whole family, and then she looked down the table at me with that smile, the one with the knife folded inside, and she said, "And of course we have Elena, who runs a little restaurant in the city. Isn't that nice?" She let the little land soft. "Deborah," she said to her club friend, "Elena cooks for strangers all week, so we're just lucky she still remembers how a family eats." And she gave a small laugh, and a few people chuckled politely, and it was, for Judith, a masterstroke, the same move she'd made 52 times a year for 6 years. The gentle public reminder that the professional was really just a girl playing at cooking, who'd forgotten what real food was. And for one more moment, the last one, I felt the old reflex rise. The 6 years of swallowing it, the pull to smile, and let it go, and keep the peace at Judith's anniversary. And then I felt Nana's tin box on the shelf of my mind, and the card that said cook for the ones who are hungry, and I set the reflex down for good. Deborah spoke before I did, and this is the part I could never have arranged, the part that only happened because Judith had gathered the wrong witness to her own performance. Deborah set down her glass and looked at me with dawning recognition and said, "Wait. Elena Russo, Lucia." She turned to the table, delighted, having no idea what she was walking into. "Is that your restaurant? My husband and I have been trying to get a reservation for a week. Ever since that review, we can't get in. It's impossible now." She turned to Judith, glowing, generous, trying to hand her friend a wonderful piece of news. "Judith, your daughter-in-law is the chef the whole city is talking about. Did you see the review? They called her gravy the best dish in the region. It's the most famous restaurant in the state right now." The table went quiet in the particular way a table goes quiet when a story everyone's been living inside cracks down the middle. Judith's smile stayed up, but her eyes went flat and confused, because two of her worlds had just collided in front of her best guests, and she did not yet understand how badly. And that was my moment, and I took it the way I'd promised myself I would, calm as still water, no knife in my voice, because I didn't need one. I reached into my bag and took out the folded copy of the review, and I did the thing I'd been doing at that table for 6 years, except this time, it wasn't a pot of sauce. I unfolded it, and I set it down on Judith's beautiful anniversary table, and I slid it toward the center where anyone could read it. "I thought some of you might not have seen it," I said, gently. "It came out last week." And I let it sit there, printed and true, in the biggest room Judith had ever gathered. Deborah read the line out loud before I could stop her, or maybe I didn't try to stop her, the line about the best dish he'd eaten in a year, And then the line I'd carried like a coal in my chest, that some cooks feed your mouth and a rare few feed the part of you that's been hungry since childhood. And then she read the part that finished it, because Julian Reeve had named the dish. And there it was, printed for 2 million people. The gravy, described as peasant food elevated to something close to holy. Peasant food. His words and hers, the exact same 2 words, tasting the exact same sauce, sitting side by side on Judith's anniversary table for her best guests to read. And I looked down the table at my mother-in-law, and I said the only thing I said to her, quietly, so the whole still room could hear it. You've called it peasant food every Sunday for 6 years, Judith. He called it peasant food too. You were both tasting the exact same sauce. The only thing that was ever different was that he came hungry, and you'd decided not to be. That was when Judith broke, and I want you to notice, the way I noticed, who stayed calm and who came apart, because 6 years had been building to that one inversion. She couldn't laugh it off, not with Deborah sitting right there having just called Lucia the most famous restaurant in the state, not with her best guests reading a national review with my name on it on her anniversary table. So she did the only thing she had left. She got loud. Well, she said, her voice climbing, brittle. That's just what those critics like now, isn't it? Rustic, peasant. I've always said it was heavy. I call it heavy. She was defending 6 years of cruelty to a table full of people who were no longer on her side, and the more she talked, the smaller she got, the way loud always gets small when the quiet thing in the room is simply true. And I stayed silent and let her, because a woman telling a room exactly who she is should never be interrupted. When she finally ran out of air, the silence after her was the loudest thing in that beautiful house. She asked me for 10 minutes alone. I want to tell you about those 10 minutes, because they were the truest conversation I ever had with my mother-in-law, and they are the reason I can tell this story without hating her. She took me into the kitchen, her kitchen, the one kingdom she'd ever ruled, and she shut the door on the party, and she took the performance off the way you take off earrings after church, item by item, until what stood there was just a 64-year-old woman with flour under her nails. And she didn't apologize, because women like Judith don't have the machinery for it. What she did was worse and better. She told me the truth. You want to know why, she said. Her voice had lost its shine. When I married into this family, my mother-in-law stood at this stove and told me in front of everyone that I'd never feed her son the way she did. Every Sunday for 11 years, until she died, she found something wrong with my cooking at her table. And the only thing I had, the only thing a woman in this family was ever allowed to be good at, was the Sunday table. So I got good at it. I got so good no one could ever take it from me again. And then my son brought home a girl who could actually cook, and I looked at you, and I saw the one thing I had left about to be taken by somebody younger, the same way it was taken from me. She looked at me, and for 1 second she wasn't a villain, she was a frightened woman who'd been handed a wound and had spent 40 years passing it down the line. So I did to you what was done to me, she said. That's not cruelty, Elena. That's just how it goes. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect after 6 years of rehearsing that kitchen, is that I believed her, all of it. The stove, the dead mother-in-law, the young woman standing there being told she'd never be enough. I could see the whole assembly line, her mother-in-law spending her spending me, the same coin of cruelty passed hand to hand down the years, until somebody either spends the next woman in line or drops the coin on the floor and refuses to pick it up. And then she made me the offer, and this is the part the fairy tale version leaves out. Because Judith is nothing if not a woman who reads a room, and she'd just watched the room turn, and so in that kitchen she pivoted, the way the truly formidable always do. Let's not do this the ugly way, she said, warming now, reaching for my hand. You're a Russo. Your success is this family's success. Come to Sundays. Bring your beautiful food. Let me tell everyone at church that my daughter-in-law is the famous chef, and we put all this behind us. I'll stand up in front of the whole family and say I was wrong about you, sweetheart. I'll give you your place at this table. All you have to do is let it go. Let it go. 6 years later, the exact words, from the mother this time instead of the son. And I want to be honest with you about the next 30 seconds, because I promised you the truth. For 30 seconds I priced it. I saw the whole landscape from a plane window, the Sundays warm at last, Judith praising me at church, the place at the table I'd been starving for since I married in. She was offering me everything I'd ever wanted. It wasn't even a trick, or not only a trick. The praise would have been real. And then I saw the flaw in the merchandise, the crack I'd been squinting past for 6 years. Her approval had arrived the exact moment I stopped needing it, the exact moment a stranger with a byline made me worth claiming, which meant it was never about the food. It was never about whether I could cook. It was about whether I was somebody the world had decided to value, and now that the world had, Judith wanted to buy back in and call it love. And here is the thing I finally understood, standing in that kitchen with her hand warm on mine. If it can be purchased, it was never the thing I was starving for. A seat at the table you can only get by being famous enough to be worth claiming is not a seat at the table, it's an invoice, and the price was pretending the last 6 years hadn't happened. So I said no, gently, the way you say true things. I said, Judith, you didn't change your mind about my cooking, a stranger changed it for you. And I'm not going to trade 6 years of Sundays for a place you're only offering me now that I'm useful. I hope your anniversary is beautiful. And I meant the manners even if I didn't mean much else, and I walked out of that kitchen, and I did not cry. But it was never really about Judith. I understood that even then. Judith was a frightened woman guarding the only bone she'd ever had. The person I actually needed to look at was sitting at the table, studying his plate, the way he had for 6 years. Paul, my husband, who had known the whole time exactly what I was, who had a national review with his own last name on it, and who, even now, even here, had not said one word. And this is the part the revenge stories always leave out, the part I have to tell you true, because dignity isn't a fairy tale and neither is a marriage. Paul and I had the real reckoning at home, away from the table, over many long and awful and honest nights. He tried the old move first, the it's just how mom is, the you know she doesn't mean it. And I told him, gently and completely, that I was done accepting a marriage where my husband managed his mother's feelings by spending my dignity, and that the 7 words he'd said to me 500 times in a dark car had done more damage than anything Judith ever said at a table, because Judith was supposed to be my rival, and he was supposed to be my person. I told him I loved him, and that love was never the question. The question was whether he could learn to stand between me and the people who cut me, instead of studying his fork, because I had spent 6 years being brave alone in that dining room, and I would not spend the rest of my life doing it. And here is the honest cost, because there's always a cost. It was not a movie. He did not transform overnight into the man I needed. There were weeks I wasn't sure the marriage would hold, weeks I slept at the restaurant, weeks his mother worked him from the other side, telling him I'd humiliated her, that I thought I was better than the family now. That's the part the fantasy skips. The price you actually pay for setting a boundary that late, after you've trained everyone for 6 years to expect you'll fold. But he did the work, slowly, and it cost him with his mother, which is exactly how I knew it was real, because the price is the proof. The next family dinner we went to, months later, when Judith tried, out of pure reflex, a small dig about restaurant food, my husband set down his fork, for the first time in his life, and said, quietly, "That's enough, Mom. Elena's food is extraordinary, and I should have said so at this table years ago." And he took my hand on top of the table where everyone could see it. It was 6 years too late, but my grandmother used to say that late is still warmer than never, and she'd know. She fed a lot of people who came to the table late, and never once turned them away hungry. The rest arrived the way real consequences do, quietly, over the year after. The Sunday cruelty ended, all at once, completely, because you cannot call a dish peasant garbage at your table when the whole state is on a wait list to pay for it, and your own club friends are quoting the review. Judith lost the one thing she'd built her whole self around, the unquestioned title of the only real cook in the family, and I never once took it from her. The truth took it, the way the truth takes a title that was never earned. I heard she stopped mentioning my restaurant to her friends entirely, which was its own small white flag. We are cordial now, Judith and I, in the careful way of 2 women who understand each other completely, and neither of whom is going to say so. I even once sent her Nana's recipe for the anise cookies she'd admired at Christmas, in my own hand, because Nana's card said cook for the hungry, and somewhere under all that armor, Judith was the hungriest person at every table she ever ruled. She never thanked me. But I heard from Gina that she made them, and that she told someone I'd sent the recipe, and for Judith, that is a cathedral of gratitude. Lucia is thriving. We expanded the reservations, hired more staff, and my grandmother's ragu is on the menu every single night, still under her word for it. Gravy, still made in 6 unhurried hours, with a whisper of cinnamon you should only miss if it's gone. I kept the tin box on the shelf in the kitchen, where I can see it every day. Sometimes on a slow afternoon, I take out the top card and read her handwriting, the line she wrote to me at 24 that I finally understood at 35. You will never make a dish good enough for a person who has decided not to like it. So cook for the ones who are hungry, not for the ones who are never satisfied. I spent 6 years cooking for the never satisfied, one Sunday at a time, trying to earn a verdict from a woman who'd fixed it before I ever lifted a lid. And the day I finally stopped, and cooked for the hungry instead, a stranger with a notebook tasted my grandmother's love, and told 2 million people it was the best thing he'd eaten all year. If there's one thing I'd carve over every kitchen table in America, it's this. There will always be people who taste your absolute best and call it peasant food, and it will almost never be about the food. It's about the one room they need to be king of, and the only power they have over you is the power you hand them by cooking for their approval, instead of for the people who are actually hungry. You don't have to shout them down, you don't have to win their verdict, and you certainly don't have to buy it back, the day the world makes you worth claiming. You just have to walk out of their small rigged kitchen and into the bigger, honest room, and set the truth on the table, once, plainly, and let it sit there being true. It was never peasant food. It was love, made by hand, the way my Nona taught me. And love, it turns out, tastes exactly like the best thing a stranger ever ate. If this reached the part of you that's still cooking for someone who decided long ago never to be satisfied, share it with somebody who needs it tonight, and tell me in the comments about the person who finally tasted your best and understood it. Subscribe to Quiet Defender Stories before you go, because next week's story starts with a wedding invitation that came with a bill attached. You'll want to be here when I open it. I'll see you in the next one.